So, welcome to the STEM Learning Centre here in York for our second question and answer session. We're delighted that we have got Tom Bennett here with us.
Hi, I'm Tom Bennett. I'm an independent behaviour advisor for the government and also the Director of Research Ed.
So, Julia's given us question number one. Thanks for that. Rather than focusing on what schools can do to improve behaviour, how can we foster greater respect for educators to place more importance on education?
I think it's a great question. I think there's two angles we can look at this from. You look at it from a societal angle, but also from an in-school angle. I think from a societal point of view, I think that we do quite a bit to make education an attractive sector to be in, a high-status sector to be in. And I know that, for example, whenever we survey people, teachers are one of the most respected and trusted professions that we have. So there is already some respect there. But when you contrast it with other countries like Finland and so on, where there are people battling one another to get into teacher training courses, where there's 15 people for each place, obviously there's a slight difference. My wife is Polish and it's the same situation over there. Teaching is a very high status profession. So what are the differences? Well, one of them I would suggest is that the pay is pretty good actually in the UK for what it is we do. And also the holidays obviously are pretty good too. I think it's the working conditions that put people off and ultimately erode the status of teaching in society at large. And by working conditions, I mean workload, but also behavioural challenge. I mean, this is something I've been talking about for a long, long time. I think that behaviour puts a lot of people off, and I think it deters a lot of people. And also, once people get into school, I think, sadly, I know this is, not a popular thing to mention, but I think that workload and excessive bureaucracy sometimes makes teaching not quite the job people thought it was going to be when they get into it. It's often quite procedural. It's often quite administrative. And there often appears to be more of that than there is of actual teaching itself. I've been teaching for 14 years. I left last September. I love teaching. It's like a phantom limb, and I miss it already. But I'll tell you what I don't miss is the paperwork. What I do miss is the classroom. And I think that's a very common experience. However, I do think that there are things that we need to look at within schools to raise the status of teaching. I mean, I don't think there's anything we can do to fix it at a social level. Because as I say, I think that the pay and the holidays are good. I think it's what we do in schools that needs to change. Now, some of that needs to come from perhaps leaning away from the high stakes accountability that we sometimes see from Ofsted, which then generates the, shall we say, excessive bureaucracy within schools. I mean, one of the things I'd love to see schools do is every once in a while have a management meeting where somebody says on the agenda, what are we going to stop doing now that we did before? There's lots of people launching new initiatives all the time. What are we going to not do anymore? Because any initiative which is launched without a view to the time available in which to do it is doomed and pointless. So there's that. Also within schools, I think that if you've got students, for example, if we want to try and look at behaviour here, if you want to get to raise the status of teachers in order to affect students' behaviour, one of the things that teachers can do, which is very profitable, is to really treat their subject seriously, is to treat everything that they do and say as important. There can be a tendency amongst teachers, particularly if you're having a very hard time, to kind of retreat into oneself a little bit. I mean, I used to teach religious studies and philosophy. Now, I love those subjects, but not everybody does. And of course, you can imagine the pushback you used to get as a teacher, as an RS teacher. I don't want to be a priest. Why are we doing this? And so on. And yet what's interesting is that if you go to the same school, you'll often find students treating mathematics or trigonometry or differential calculus as something very, very important. You must get this GCSE. This is terribly important. And why do pupils think that's important? Why don't pupils think this is pointless? I mean, some will, obviously. And it's because the school treats it as important. Because the teachers say, this is really important. You must get this. So what any teacher can do, and this is the advice I usually give to RS teachers, but any teacher of any subject, if you want to raise your status within the classroom itself, treat your subject seriously. Tell your pupils how much you enjoy your subject and how much you respect your subject and how important it is that they pass this. And what you mustn't do is to suggest for 1 second that this subject is somehow a second-class subject, because the minute you start treating it like that, the students do. And once the students see the subject as being less important, that's when they start to see You is less important and the classroom culture is less important. That's when they feel that this is the subject they can misbehave in. So that's a start. So this is a complex issue which requires multiple strategies to impact upon it. But I think that when you want to try and raise the status of teachers, first of all, you have to raise the status of teachers within the school itself.
Our next question is from Sandy. Does the promotion of deep learning in students not delivering for the exam enhance positive behaviour in the classrooms? Interesting question.
This is deep learning, I suppose, in contrast to teaching to the test, i.e. treating the subject instrumentally as something only valuable because you're aiming for a test. Now, one of the things that really switches students off is making them think that a subject isn't important. And one of the ways in which we do that, sadly, and probably unconsciously, is by saying this subject is only important because there's a certificate at the end of it. Now, it's interesting that most people I know who've gone to university or who teach or who have some kind of tertiary level of education value education intrinsically. Think that knowing things is valuable for itself. You could even argue this from a kind of a scientific point of view, that it's useful to do research into things which don't appear to be particularly valuable at the time because you never know when it's going to be useful. So that's one angle on it. The other angle is that things are just not useful, but meaningful and valuable anyway. So when we treat a subject as something which is only to be taught to the test, the students pick up on this. Now, don't get me wrong, this will motivate them up to a point if the student views a certificate as important, but if the student doesn't think they're going to do particularly well on a test, or the student doesn't think that the certificate is required in order for them to succeed in life, i.e. if they don't care about the product of that instrumental approach, then the student is going to inevitably switch off from that subject unless they like it accidentally, or they like you, or some kind of, accident of good behaviour. So it's a dangerous approach to say you must study this subject because this exam is very important. It's part of the approach, but what every teacher needs to do, which I think refers back to my previous question a little bit, which is to treat the subject as intrinsically valuable. Again, this is something I learned a great deal when I was teaching religious studies. I believe my subject is important. I think it's important to understand not just religion, but why people believe certain things, why people disagree, philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, and so on. I think this is part of the inheritance every student should get before they leave school, just like literacy or numeracy or knowledge of the scientific world. So promoting deep learning, and that's a slightly weasel term, it means a lot of things to a lot of people, is, I believe, morally the right thing to do for us as teachers, and B, is, from a utilitarian point of view, is a far more useful thing to do, rather than just say, let's teach the test. And incidentally, the problem with teaching to the test is you're trying to guess what the examiner is going to present. You're going to try and guess what they're looking for. And while I've got absolutely no problem whatsoever with helping children understand the structure of an exam, I mean, that's just common sense. But to go further than that and suggest, let's just try and focus on guessing what the examiner's thinking, well, that's not learning anymore. That's truly jumping through hoops. And I think as educators, we should stay well away from that, because that will switch children off from the subject, and it will make the less capable of getting high grades and high certificates, less willing to play along behaviourally.
And we've got question 3 from Sarah. Sarah says, how do you deal with passive resistance? Always a challenging one.
There are a lot of students, either in tutorial situations or in mainstream education or any other setting you can imagine, who are very passively resistant to the instructions of the classroom. I mean, this is terribly common. Low-level disruption is the most common form of disruption that most teachers face. I would argue that the most common version of low-level disruption is just not engaging very much with the material, just doing as little as possible. Producing a sentence when they need a paragraph, looking at you after asking 3 or 4 times, and so on. I mean, every teacher who's ever dealt with a human being knows this is one of the biggest problems they have. One of the things I would suggest that teachers could find really useful is to try and recalibrate what they mean by misbehavior. Now, some teachers think that misbehavior just means actively being rude, throwing a chair, sneering, bullying somebody else, disrespecting a teacher, and so on in a very open and vocal way. I think, and I categorise misbehaviour as anything which impedes the learning in that classroom. I would also add a subset, which is anything which violates the dignity of anybody else in that classroom. Because learning isn't the only goal of a classroom. A classroom is a social context, and you also want to treat people with dignity. It's a social context too, where we have to treat one another as members of a community. So it's not just about learning. Learning is a very important part of it, of course. So when a student isn't engaging with the work, when the student is doing their very best to do their very least, when the student is actually putting more effort in to do little than they could be doing if they were doing more, then the teacher needs to see that as misbehavior. It's not nothing. It's not neutral. It's not, well, at least they're not misbehaving. They are misbehaving if they're not doing as you ask them to do. Now, the first thing any good teacher should do in that context is to try and work out, is there a reason why they're not accessing the work? I mean, that's the first thing you need to do. Just some simple diagnostic questions like, do you understand this? Do you have the tools in order to do this task? Did you understand my explanation of it? These really simple things which can unpick and unpack some of the problems. I've had students in my class whom only after thorough investigation have I discovered they've got a reading age of 7 years old when I'm supposed to be teaching them, year 9 or year 10 subjects. So, these kind of things really, really matter. However, you can usually find these things out relatively quickly. And I'm not going to suggest for 1 second that most misbehaviour is due to some kind of deep-seated problem or deep-seated need. We're often told that misbehaviour is a form of communication. I mean, it can be, but in my experience, the vast majority of misbehaviours, the vast majority of not engaging with the work, it's just simply the child being a bit lazy or wanting to have a bit of a laugh, and that's because they're human, and we're all a bit like that sometimes. That's not to deride children in any sense. So once you've assessed, is there an issue here? If there isn't, if it's just them not switching onto the work when they should do, treat that as misbehaviour. And there are a million different ways in which we can offer feedback to pupils in order to amend their behaviours. You could take a very classic behaviourist approach, for example, and you could incentivise by rewarding, and you could disincentivise by some kind of deterrence or sanction. Sometimes sanctions are seen a bit of a dirty word in education. I don't believe that for a second. I think they are very useful. In fact, they are a necessary part of our repertoire when we're dealing with pupils' behaviours. So, for example, if a pupil doesn't produce as much work as they should do in a learning session, and you know they're capable of it, and you know they chose to do it, and they could have done otherwise, if you know all of these things, then they have to stay behind and do it later on. I mean, it's a really simple approach, and many teachers will do this, and some teachers don't like that. They think it's too punitive. I don't think it's punitive at all. I think it's a necessary response to not doing the work when they should have done it. In addition to that, ask them to stay behind. Obviously, I'm talking about older children here. Ask them to stay behind, do the work anyway. They get a little bit of extra coaching, so they get a little bit more one-to-one time. You can start to maybe try and unpick the problems as to why they're not doing it, but you reassure them that every time they do that, they will be back doing it after school when they need to be with their friends or playing or doing football and so on. And it doesn't matter what they've got to go to, unless, of course, it's a serious family issue. But if they've got football or they want to meet friends, too bad. Keep them behind and do the work. Most children, no matter how good or bad they are at maths, are good at doing the maths here. And they can work out the cost-benefit analysis. What time would I rather lose, my time or classroom time? And most pupils, and I mean 99% of pupils, will do the maths and think, you know what, next time I'll just do it. And to some extent, it's a process of attrition. They might try it again and again and again, but you just keep being there for them. You just keep reminding them that you have high expectations of these pupils. So treat all misbehaviour as misbehaviour and raise your expectations of that pupil. And one of the biggest problems that some teachers find themselves in is that the pupil can persist with this low level of output for so long that the teacher then starts to think, well, that's just normal for them. That's where they are. I can't expect too much from that pupil. I'll go and hang out with these lovely pupils over here who are producing paper mache volcanoes and so on. Now, that's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. Not the latter, but more of the former. We need to be focusing on these pupils and saying, I don't accept that from you. You can do better. Which is why I really think this kind of there's a bit of a debate about high expectations, and is it dignified or not? I think it's incredibly dignified to say to a pupil, you're worth more than this. You can do better than this. I don't accept that from you. I don't know if anybody out there is familiar with the original Rocky films, but if you remember Rocky's little trainer, Burgess Meredith, I think the little guy on the bicycle cycling alongside Rocky saying, work harder, do it again, run more. That's what teachers need to be like, kind of like a coach. And by that, I mean a bit of a hard ass, a personal trainer. You can do 5 more reps. I don't accept that from you in a positive way. You can be as kind as you like, but you're going to be absolutely insistent. And that's what a real teacher does. So to me, I think when you say, if a child is passively resistant, that's the way you approach it. You say to them, that's not good enough. I believe in you. I believe in you so much that you're not going to get away with that.
Our next question is from Warren. Thanks for your question, Warren. How do you change the way parents and students perceive rules so that they are not negative?
Okay, I get asked about rules a lot. And it's a good question. How do we change the perceptions of parents and students so they don't see rules as being somehow kind of negative? It's funny. I mean, I do a lesson with my year sevens occasionally, and I ask them to imagine what the world would be like if we didn't have any rules. If suddenly rules were abolished, if an alarm went off and suddenly said the laws were abolished, and of course the year sevens, the vast majority of them think, oh boy, this will be great. And they often mention things like, running off to sweet shops and to toy shops and so on, and just taking as much as they want. The usual kind of inclinations. And yet, after about 5 minutes of discussing this, normally the brightest ones start to go, hang on, wait a minute. If there's no rules for me, then there's no rules for anyone else, which means somebody else can rob me. And very, very quickly, the sharpest tools in the box will say to me something like, I would find an island and a castle. I would take my family and I would protect them, because these children have realized that if you took away rules from any community, it would be chaos. It would be chaos. I mean, you don't have to be a student of political philosophy to understand that true anarchism has never really worked on any level whatsoever, other than tiny, tiny groups for very, very short periods of time. No community can survive without agreed rules and consequences to breaking those rules. Because if there are no consequences to breaking rules, then people will realize eventually, oh, well, we can just get away with it. It's a bit like the old Robin Williams joke. If you remember him, Robin Williams, the comedian, used to say that he didn't understand how British policemen could enforce anything because they didn't have any guns. And he used to say, stop, or I'll say stop again. And that's kind of, the image we have if we have a community with no rules. Eventually someone will go, I don't have to obey these. You can't just rule a community on kindness alone, sadly, because there'll always be somebody who wants to exploit that situation. Thomas Hobbes, I think, always said that it only takes one thief for everyone to have to put bars on their windows. And that's a sad truism, but it is a truism. Whether it's sad or not, it's true. So when it comes to things like schools and so on, not only are schools are rules a necessary evil, but they are necessary. So they're not an evil at all. In fact, they're a positive good. If you took them away, things would be awful. Things would be awful. Even if you have a group of really kind, self-regulating adults together in a social situation, even they will tend to agree tacitly, silently, on rules of conduct which they will agree to kind of go by. And anytime you have a group of more than 2 or 3 people, you need to have agreed rules, because everybody's got very different values and very different senses of what right and wrong is and how we should proceed and so on. So rules are not a necessary evil. They are a positive good because they enable a community to flourish. If you have a classroom where you say to all the children, do what you like, you will be very fortunate indeed if they all decide to do something which contributes to maximizing and optimizing the common good. That's just not going to happen unless you've got 25 extremely extraordinary pupils. So what you want to do is you need to say to pupils, right, we are going to abide by a certain set of rules in order for us to all flourish as much as possible. As much as possible. This is actually a very common thing that people discuss in political philosophy. How much liberty can we actually have in any society, in any group? And there's an interesting paradox here, that if you give everybody all the freedom in the world, weirdly enough, we all end up with far less freedom than you would before. But if you restrict people's liberty just a little bit, you end up with more liberty overall. And that's exactly what happens in a classroom. So you say to them, we've got some agreed rules which are uncontroversial, like nobody shouts out, nobody leaves without my permission, we treat one another with respect and dignity, and so on. And these really basic rules, if you just implant them in a classroom, transform the classroom once they are successfully applied and consistently applied. Because if we don't apply them consistently, it's almost like having no rules at all. It's like having like a corrupt police or something like that. So the rules have to be consistent. But once the rules are in place, and they should be good rules, obviously, then this is how we can actually have a flourishing school community. So that's how I would sell it to parents and teachers. And incidentally, I do sell it to every single one of my class. I say to them, I love my subject. I love teaching. I really want you to all succeed, and I believe you can, which is why we're going to have some rules so we're all going to succeed together. And that's how I sell it. And I have not had a single pupil yet who's disagreed with that. Or maybe they just haven't dared to. I don't know.
The next question we're going to talk about is really important, I think, and it comes from Harushian. How can you sustain positive improvements in behaviour? And I think what we mean here really is about maintaining that in the classroom over the longer period.
It's a very common question to be asked, how we can maintain good behaviour over a long period of time. It's possible to have a big impact for a short period of time. I mean, we can see this from any number of poorly planned research initiatives in schools. Often the very fact that children are doing something novel can have a big impact on their behaviour for a short period of time. If you're, for instance, if you're a teacher that goes into a school and teaches an interview lesson, then the children, just through sheer novelty of not knowing who you are, might give you 50 minutes of perfect behaviour because they're quite unsure as to what's going on. So yes, we have to be very careful about looking at the difference between short-term and long-term impacts. I suppose this is kind of a Pepsi challenge for most teachers. You might like the sweetness, but do you like it for a long, long time? For me, the way you enact true behavioural change, which is long-lasting, is by habituating behaviour. Now, human beings are enormously social animals. We know this. We look to one another for behavioural cues all the time. Now, that's the theory behind the very common practice of taking a poorly behaved pupil and putting them in a well-behaved class and hoping that it kind of somehow rubs off on them. And actually, many times it does. And it's the reason why parents want their children to hang out with very well-behaved peers rather than, falling in with a bad crowd. And there's a very good reason for that, because children will take enormous interest in what their peers are doing. And sometimes a lot more even than what their parents are doing or what they're told to do by the school. Friendship, peer pressure is extraordinarily powerful. So what we try to do in a classroom situation is we try to set up a set of social norms which everybody understands, and that's why we have rules, but not just rules, but also routines. So you can have school rules, but you can also have kind of slightly more unspoken routines. And these are the social norms you want children to aspire to. Now, the way in which you embed them is by making them clear for a start. The second way you embed that is by demonstrating it yourself and also facing up to pupils that don't do it and congratulating pupils that do it. So you create this kind of sense of this social norm. So you say, well done, Nadine, for bringing all your equipment today. And if someone else doesn't, like Billy doesn't bring his equipment, you'll say, Billy, what's the class rule on bringing your homework? These kind of things matter. And you reinforce this, and you do something about it when people don't do it. If you want people to line up outside your class, I don't care what you do, but let's say you want them to line up outside your class, then you make sure they line up. And you don't just let it dissolve eventually because you don't care or because you can't be bothered. You enforce it all the time. And eventually you habituate children into these practices. And here's the thing. We can't control their minds, which is a good thing I'm going to suggest. We don't have the Jedi mind trick. But what we can require them is to change their behaviour. And once you change their behaviour over a long enough period of time, it becomes a habit. Now, habits have to be maintained by them, but also by us. Because we're asking them to do something which they may not be naturally inclined to do. For example, sitting still and learning maths, I'm going to suggest, is not something that most children want to do at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. However, we're asking them to do that. So we need to maintain that boundary. We need to patrol that boundary. And we patrol it with lots of nudges and lots of incentives and sometimes a sanction, sometimes a reward, and lots of conversations and so on. But most importantly, we mention it, we communicate it constantly. We give them feedback all the time. This is required to be done. You never ever achieve perfect behaviour. You never get a chance where you can relax. You always have to manage your boundaries, even with the best behaved classes. Because if the children see that your foot is off the pedal, they will naturally start to gravitate like water towards the path of least resistance. This is human. We all do this quite a lot, and if you give us enough time, most of us will. So you create habits by expecting certain behaviours over a long period of time, and then you patrol it. I mean, even Aristotle used to talk about this, that how we change people's character is by changing their habits, because once you've changed their habit, the habit becomes internalised, and guess what? That's what character is. That's what character is. Character simply means how you traditionally or temperamentally tend to respond to certain situations. And then retrospectively, we assign a value to that. We say somebody was kind. We say they were lazy. We say they were hardworking, because we look at their behaviour. How do they habitually operate? If somebody's good at waking up in the morning, we say, that they are, they are, I'm trying to think of a word to describe it. They're good at getting up in the morning. We just missed that. That was a terrible. But, you get, so hardworking, conscientious, something like that. So that's how we enforce it. And we can do this with all manners of character traits. So, for example, if you want somebody to be kind, you demonstrate what kindness means in a concrete scenario, in a concrete situation. You are kind yourself. You reprimand somebody when they're not kind. You reward them when they are kind. And you constantly do that for a long, long time until everyone understands what kindness actually means in your classroom culture. And that's how you maintain long-term behavioural change. It is not easy. The fruits of it are enormous. And I often say to teachers, you must invest in this initial cultural change with your class. You must invest in this building up of a relationship, but building up of their characters until they become the people you need them to become. Because when you do that, you reap the rewards for years, although it's still hard work, but you reap the rewards. If you don't do that, you're teaching the same lesson for 6 or 7 years. And not only do you not reap the rewards, but you're fighting the same battles.
That's really interesting, Tom, because as a science teacher, one of the habituations of routine is, working in a science lab. And so therefore you have many routines around entering the classroom, where your bag, where you sit, how your hair is tied up, within the laboratory. And that's something that's quite distinct in the science classroom, I think. Maintaining that over a long period of time. I remember when I was working in Bradford, children many years later, after I'd got them into that routine, and I hadn't taught them for 2 or 3 years, would then come back into the classroom, my space, and use those routines without even thinking. It's like I've infiltrated them, I've habituated those routines into them. So I think that will really resonate with quite a lot of science teachers and the learners on this course. Great. So our next question is also from Harushan. His question seemed to be very popular with our learners today. How do you manage the most challenging of students where talking and advising them is not producing significant changes?
This is one of the most common problems that teachers tend to ask me. You've tried to speak to a student, you've tried to reason with them, you're trying to get them to amend the behaviour, but it's still not working. Well, there's a lot of things to be said about that. Number one is, first of all, what is it you're saying to them? If your conversations with pupils, let's say after the lesson, let's say you've tried to talk them around to your way of thinking. If your conversation is pleading, if your conversation is, oh, go on, please behave for me, then that's already going to be very problematic, because a lot of pupils don't respond to that kind of approach. If you make it feel like their behaviour is optional, if you make them think that behaving better is an option, then again, a lot of students will just vote with their egos and decide to behave in the way they want to behave anyway. So it's a bit like saying, here's some homework, but you don't have to do it. But it'd be nice if you did. Then a lot of students are going to go, why should I do that? So if you say to them, oh, go on, please try next time, then kids might go, yeah, well, maybe so, maybe no. Now, that's not the way the relationship between an adult and a student should be, or sorry, a teacher and a student should be. There needs to be an authoritative relationship there. And I mean that in a very positive way. I don't mean that in a kind of brutal authoritarian way. I mean that in the sense that you're doing it for their benefit. If you're just going to try and intimidate a pupil into behaving better next time, then a lot of pupils will just laugh scornfully and say, is that all you've got? I mean, a lot of students get far worse at home. And also, when we face up to a student in that way, when we're terribly, terribly aggressive, we're essentially presenting a ritual that many animals do in many, many different social settings, which is we're puffing up our chest and we're making ourselves look bigger and more threatening to try and intimidate. And what we're essentially trying to do, what animals are essentially trying to do, is to avoid a fight. They're trying to reduce the chance of being attacked themselves. Now, obviously, in a classroom setting, that's a ludicrous context. If you're trying to threaten a pupil physically or intimidate them verbally, all a student needs to do is just puncture your little balloon, and they realise that they're like the Wizard of Oz. There's just a little man behind the screen, and there's nothing you can actually do. And you're not going to strike them. My God, of course not. So that kind of aggression usually doesn't work. So being pleading doesn't work. Being aggressive doesn't work. So what is it you're saying to them? If you're pointing out to them the error of their ways, if you're trying to reason with them, if you're trying to be rational with them, I would argue that's a very good approach to take, but most pupils don't misbehave for rational reasons. They're not misbehaving because they just didn't understand, that their behaviour was poor. Most pupils are misbehaving because they're enjoying the situation. They like the attention. They want to get a rise out of their friends. They want to get a rise out of you. They don't want to do the work. Don't get me wrong, there are many people who are misbehaving for reasons that they don't understand. And sometimes you can reason with people. Sometimes you can say, do you see the impact this is having on me, on your classmates, on your education? And sometimes they may go, okay, fair enough. So I would use a bit of reason. But sometimes people just need to be told, this is totally unacceptable. You can't do this. And you have to present this norm as not being an option. This norm you're presenting is the way things are. I always say that the most effective way we change classroom behaviours is by, achieving some kind of habitual change. We're trying to create a culture within the classroom. And by culture, I mean it in its simplest form. By culture, I mean this is the way we do things around here. And actually, the tone I'm using to you just now is very much the tone I would use to a student if I was having this kind of conversation. I believe what I'm saying. I care about you. I want you to do better. I want us all to do better. But in order for that to happen, you're going to have to behave this way. So it's very assertive, but at the same time, it doesn't need to be brutal. It doesn't need to be authoritarian. So there's three things I tend to suggest when students need their behaviour amended and they're just not responding to a nice chat. And one is, first of all, I mentioned this earlier, investigation. Is there a reason why they're not engaging with the work? Is there some kind of functional illiteracy problem? Is there something awful going on at home that you don't know about, which is making their emotions seep into everything that they do? That's something worth knowing about, and then you can respond appropriately. But again, if you find out that there's nothing particularly difficult going on, so you've done your investigation, then what we suggest is attrition. You just say to people, look, you're going to have to stay behind. I'm going to call your mum in. We're going to have this conversation 100 times. You're going to have to redo that piece of work. Whatever your response is, you make sure that you keep that up. A lot of students will respond very quickly to, for example, one simple detention. They'll suddenly go, oh my goodness, this teacher means business. And a lot of pupils won't. A lot of pupils will see, let's see how far we can push this person. And that's why you really have to keep it up. You have to use almost like a war of attrition with some of these pupils. You will wear them down. These pupils are normally not Moriartys of crime. They'll normally give up relatively quickly. They just want to see how far they can push you. And unless there's some other kind of extenuating circumstance or some kind of particular SEN need which needs to be addressed, this attrition is normally the way you get through pupils, because it shows them that you mean business and you're not going to be worn down. You are diamond. You're not going to be worn down. Attrition. And here's the thing. I don't recommend that you just simply keep using detentions or calling parents home all the time. You have to escalate. So investigation, attrition, and then escalation. If it's not working, if your pupil gets 2 or 3 detentions for the same thing, and more importantly, if they get 2 or 3 detentions for the same thing in a short period of time, then obviously the same thing isn't going to, the same kind of sanction response isn't going to work. You need to escalate. You need to take this into another level, and that usually means getting somebody else involved. Now, it could be a parent. That's often very powerful. It could be a head of house, a head of year, a line manager, whatever, head of department. It could be someone from the SLT. Whatever you do, you have to get somebody else involved. And most school behaviour policies are escalatory policies, in the sense that if a pupil persistently misbehaves, something has to happen. Now, it might be a nurturing process. There might be, as I say, there might be a learning need that has to be addressed. They might have to be taken out and do 3 weeks of systematic synthetic phonics or something like that, so they can access the written work. I don't know. But whatever it is, there needs to be an escalation. The pupils need to see they can't just get away with it and the same thing will happen to them all the time. Because again, for many pupils, a short detention is nothing. But what they need to see is that the school cares about them, but cares enough also to confront and face up to their misbehaviours, because not only is it damaging them, but it's damaging the education of people around about them. So, investigation, attrition, escalation.
So we've got one from Sonna next. Could or should you use peer pressure to address misbehaviour?
Using peers to address misbehaviour is fraught with difficulty, and it's also fraught with landmines as well, because you don't have to have read Tom Brown's School Days to appreciate the dangers of creating a climate where students feel like they can monitor and punish other people for misbehaviours. You know, there's a real kind of Lord of the Flies danger there, that students can set themselves up as judge, jury and executioner. There's a reason why the teacher, the adult, needs to be in charge of the justice in the classroom. Not because children are naturally stupid, but because adults naturally have that right and authority and possibly the nuance and the maturity to decide these kind of things. That said, I'm a huge believer in creating an environment or a culture whereby the behavioural expectations are policed in a very, very soft, very passive way by the expectations of every member of that community. So, for example, when you walk down the street and you see somebody doing something wrong, like stealing some flowers or something like that. Now you can you could look at that and just go, well, that's none of my business. Or you could say something like, please stop stealing those flowers. Or you could say, oh, I'll just wait for a policeman to deal with that. But of course, in a society, in any kind of culture, we don't just leave it for someone else to sort out. If we think it's wrong, we tend to get involved and say you shouldn't do that. If somebody lit up a cigarette or an underground, that's a better example. You wouldn't just wait for a policeman to come. 90% of people would say, could you please put that cigarette out? We self-police to a very passive extent. Now, of course, nobody there is going to take it to the extreme. I hope. No one's going to start a fight or try and put anyone in prison. But there's that kind of peer pressure, that social pressure. So what you want to do, for example, is I've worked in a lot of schools where there's very, very low respect for academic aspirations. In fact, I've worked in schools where there's sometimes an anti-intellectualism which pervades the culture of the classroom. And we've all seen this. I was in a classroom recently where the students who had done their homework didn't want to admit they'd done their homework, because most of the class hadn't done their homework. So they didn't want to look like they were standing out and being swats. But again, we see this on lots of levels. I'm sure you were a SWAT at school. I was a SWAT at school. And, you get called a SWAT a lot if you hand in your homework and you put your hand up and so on. Sometimes it's passive and sometimes it's quite aggressive. So you want the pupils to be the reverse of that. You want them to celebrate academic achievement. You go to some schools, for example, where you've created this social norm where if a pupil gives a really good answer, the teacher can say, can we have a round of applause for that answer? And the kids all do it. And they do it not in a kind of an ironic, nasty way. They do it in a kind of a celebratory way. I go to some schools, for example, where they have lots and lots of reward celebratory assemblies. And the assemblies can be rewarding things like, something as minor as attendance, but it also can be something exceptional, like some kind of extraordinary achievement. And that's a wonderful thing to do and to see. So you want to get your pupils involved in that kind of passive supervisory way. But what you don't want them to get involved in is actually administering the social norms of the classroom in a way that should be managed by the teacher.
Next, we have from Taya. How do you deal with low-level issues without disrupting the flow of the lesson? Good question.
One of the key skills every teacher needs to have is knowing how to run a room. I sometimes don't even call it managing classroom behaviour. I just call it running a room, running the space for the benefit of everybody to maximise the academic, the social, and I guess the kind of the human rewards that being in a classroom can offer. So you want them to learn. You want them to learn about being in a community, and you also want to treat them with dignity and get them understanding what it means to treat others with dignity. Pedagogy is one thing. Knowing how to teach a subject is one thing, but also knowing when to intervene is extraordinarily important. Many pupils will misbehave because they want you to react, or they're trying to achieve some kind of reaction, whether it be some kind of self-esteem or whatever. And what some pupils love to do is to see you react when they want you to react. So let's say you're trying to give instructions to a class, and you're taking 2 or 3 minutes to give some complex instructions. Now somebody could be misbehaving in a very low level way at the side of you. Maybe you can just hear them whispering away. Maybe they're on their phone. Right? So maybe they're not disrupting too many people. The temptation for most teachers, particularly new teachers, is to leap on that misbehaviour, is to stop what they're doing and to deal with the misbehaviour. We are very, very reactive sometimes, and I get why. It's very easy to react to situations as they occur. It's very hard to ignore misbehaviour when it occurs. We're very tuned into, I think possibly we're evolved to tune into discord and difficulty and pain and misery. That's why the news is so full of it. But the danger for a teacher there is what you've done is you've disrupted the lesson for the 25 other people in the classroom who are sitting there waiting for you to deal with this one pupil with a mobile phone or whatever it is. So the thing I try to reassure teachers is, if you want to try and deal with misbehaviour without interrupting the flow, is you deal with misbehaviour when you are ready. You deal with misbehaviour, or any behaviour in fact, when you think it's most useful. So you can tacitly, you can silently ignore, or could I perhaps even say tactically ignore pupils' misbehaviour until you're ready. So you can give the instructions to the class. Once you've done that, good, you've got 25 people on course and on task. Now you've got time to deal with the misbehaviour. So by tactically ignoring, I don't mean ignoring, I mean ignoring until you're ready. And that's how you keep the flow of the class going. Now, obviously, you might have to break that rule if the misbehaviour absolutely requires an instant response. They might be doing something dangerous, for example. They might be saying something racist or terribly sexist, or they might be saying something or doing something which is going to inflame a situation which gets incredibly bad very quickly, like a fight. Also, there are sometimes you have to jump in, but that's part of the professional judgment of the teacher, knowing when you have to intervene and when you don't. If you don't try to control your own reactions, the pupils will control your reactions, and they'll lead you like a little puppet through the whole lesson. And in fact, some pupils are very, very astute at this. Some pupils are very, very practiced and skilled at this, and can disrupt a whole lesson like this by simply getting you to react like a pinball off all of the misbehaviours. So I think that's a key thing that every teacher needs to see in action and then need to practice themselves.
Our final question is from Rachel. The most popular pupil is influencing the behaviour of my classes. Consequences reward systems don't work. Will persistent reinforcement work?
Yeah, there's a lot to be done when you've got a very popular student in the class who's kind of setting the tone of behaviour for the rest of the class. I talk a lot about social norms and social cues because, because they're quite easy to grasp as a concept for teachers, and B, because they're so powerful. And you do very often get very powerful personalities setting the norm. And this is why the teacher needs to set the culture. Because if the teacher doesn't decide to consciously design or become the architect of the culture of the classroom, somebody else will. You can't just hope that things will be fine. If you don't design how kids act in the classroom, then somebody, usually the most powerful personality or group of personalities, will decide. And if you're lucky, they'll be really hardworking and kind pupils, but that's not very likely. What tends to happen is it's the biggest show-offs and the people with the biggest mouths tend to lead the conversation and drive the discourse in classroom behaviour. So what's really interesting is that when you're a student in a classroom, the classroom is your world, or at least at that moment it is, and your peer group is your world. And, the person who's at the top of the heap appears to be very, very, very powerful indeed. I remember being at school and looking at, the most popular kids, the best looking kids, and just thinking, wow, these people run the school. These people are in charge. They've got it all. You see this whenever you watch teen movies, particularly American teen movies. I don't know why British ones are more negative, but American teen movies, there's always like the popular set, the mean girls, and everyone treats them like gods and so on. Now that's interesting because actually from a pupil's point of view, that's kind of true. But here's the weird thing. Suddenly when you are a 40-year-old or 30-year-old teacher looking at students in a classroom, all of a sudden, the cool kid doesn't seem so cool anymore. And the best looking kid in the class, you just think, why is anyone looking at this pupil? But, who cares? The important thing to remember is that their world matters and their world is important. But you know what? You've got a job to do. And the classroom culture is far, far more important to you as a vehicle, as a mechanism for achieving some kind of enormous benefit for these children's lives. I mean, you're here to do a job, and that job is, to me, it's sacred, and it's to help them to learn as scholars and as people. So if there is a gobby, popular child in that class, just apply the same old sanctions as you would to them, or the same old reprimands, or the same old behavioural feedback you would give to them or to anyone in a similar circumstance. Some teachers get into this really weird thing whereby they feel like they can't speak to some pupils. Like, oh no, they're too naughty or they're too popular. That's really weird, because as a teacher, all of a sudden you're putting yourself in the place of a student, which is very, very bizarre. Treat every pupil as being of equal value, but concomitantly, that means that you can talk to any student you want. So if a student is really mucking about, use the usual sanctions and rewards and encouragements and nudges and deterrents that you would for anyone else. But also, absolutely consider neutralising that peer influence by taking them out. There's nothing wrong with a removal occasionally. So if a kid is acting up and setting the tone in the class, cut the head of the hydra off, cut the head of the snake off, park them somewhere else. Have them sit with their pastoral head for a little while, park them in another classroom, move their seats even perhaps less radically, put them somewhere else, put them right next to you. And do something which says that, you might be popular in your own little group here, but I'm in charge of this classroom. And there's a fabulous line from The King's Speech, if you remember that film, The King's Speech, where the king goes to see a speech therapist who's, of course, a mere commoner. And the King of England goes all the way into this guy's apartment and lights a cigarette up. And Lionel Logue, who is the Australian speech therapist, says to the king, put that out. And the king says, hang on, I'm the king. Starts to splutter. And Lionel Logue, the therapist, says, my room, my rules. And that's what it is as a teacher. My room, my rules. Not because I'm some kind of hard ass who's better than you, but because I'm your teacher. And I know what you need for your benefit. And your benefit isn't best served by some gobby loudmouth talking about how many, cigarettes they can fit in their mouth at one time, or whatever. I don't know what makes kids popular these days, but, how many skateboards they can skate. There you go. That just dated me.
That's great, thank you. So we've just, I think again, I agree. We've had this sort of idea about being the adult in the room. You're the one that's in control, and therefore having a really consistent approach. I always used to say I had 3 rules in the classroom. One is be nice. 2 is no swearing, and the 3rd one is I'm in charge. and those 3 rules made it very easy, because if they said I don't want to go out of the classroom, I said that's rule 3, I'm in charge. And you didn't have to get into any conflict around that one.
I love how your rules there make it sound like you're a really nice person, be kind to one another. You start off with be kind to one another. So you start off basically as a Care Bear, and then by the end of it you're Judge Dredd. Everything I say goes. Or else. So well done. Well done. You really sold that to me. I was thinking 3 rules, that's not, I get it now. The 3rd was every rule. Well done.
Oh, and Tom, I'm sure we can have an extra question out of you. I've got a really good one from Claudine. So, should you use refusal to allow participation in extracurricular activities as a punishment for persistent misbehaviour?
Let me reframe that slightly. Should you take a pupil out of an extracurricular activity as a response to their misbehaviour? Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. The school isn't just a series of classrooms. The classrooms are a cell or cells. The department is an organ. The school itself is an organism. It all operates to mutual benefit. If a pupil is terribly rude to a teacher, or does something dreadful to another pupil, or simply damages their own education, then 99 times out of 100, there's no reason why the school should then endorse that behaviour and support it, and in some ways enable it by saying, well, never mind all that, but you can still go and do this nice thing as well. Now, there are some exceptions to this, but I would say by and large, the pupil needs to realise that all of the benefits which they accrue at school are connected. And that includes their education as well as their, as their non-academic curriculum, their sporting curriculum, their chess clubs, their debating championships, or whatever. These things are all connected, as they are in society. For instance, I can't go out and break somebody's window and then go and do somebody a good deed like helping an old lady across the road and say, oh, come on, it all balances out. You know, I'm still going to get in trouble for that just because I did something good somewhere else. So this pupil might be, for instance, you know, the head of the football team, but that's their decision to remove themselves from that. And the thing is, the more you reinforce with pupils that all of these things are connected, the more they'll want to behave because they'll realize that one thing will jeopardize the other. Now, I did say there were some exceptions to that, and I should offer a little bit of nuance here. It's very rare that anything I would ever say about what you should do in a school is 100% universal. I don't believe there are many things which are 100% universally efficient. So, for example, you might have a student who's so far removed from identifying themselves as being part of the school community, who's so far disengaged from the curriculum, that there might be one thing at school, the only thing at school they like is maybe, you know, whatever, the chess club, the basketball team or something. And so for a short period of time, you might, I'm going to stress, you might, for a short period of time, use that as a lever to kind of get them, pull them into the school community a little bit more. Because for some people, that's their lifeboat. That's the only thing they care about, and that's the only thing they're good at. It's the only thing they get self-esteem from. And if you take that away from them, then, you know, they've got nothing left. But I will stress that's an extreme circumstance. I mean, I believe that we should have exceptions to every rule, but exceptions must be exceptional. And by and large, 99 times out of 100, you do want to make a link between getting some kind of positive reward and affirmation elsewhere in the school with doing well throughout the whole of your school. Otherwise, you get a kind of situation where, you know, for example, and I'm using a kind of a cliched example here, that the pupil gets a football game, but they're misbehaving in maths. Otherwise, you get a situation where the pupil thinks that, you know, it's okay to misbehave in maths, but you've got to behave in PE. That's not the case. They've got to behave everywhere because the school's a community.
Yes, thanks so much for your participation and your wise words to all of our learners out there.
Thank you. You're welcome. I love it.
So thanks to all our learners for all of your fantastic questions. It's really difficult to choose the ones, and you use the ones that you like the most to ask Tom. Really enjoyed working with you on this course. I hope you enjoy the rest of the activities that you're going to be doing. I think that we will be running some more courses coming up. There's always plenty to do, and we've got some new courses as well coming up as well, so go and have a look at those ones too. So I hope to join you again for another question and answer session in the future, and obviously we say massive thanks to Tom Bennett for joining us. Thank you very much.